Okay, so let's get started. This week we're going to be reading Parashat Zachor in Knis, right? So it's one of my favorite feelings because, Parashat Zachor is always the Shabbat right before Purim. So, it brings you into the mood, and Purim is one of my favorite holidays. And there's a bunch of reasons for that, but I thought it would be great to study about Zachor before we read Parashat Zachor. So like that, when we hear the Torah this Shabbat, we are ready. So let me tell you, we have the source sheets, and anybody who wants a source sheet, it's right over there. We're going to be going through a bunch of sources on the source sheets. But there's something interesting because there's many nations in the world, right? And every nation has a national axis, which basically says how the nation runs and governs itself as a nation. And there's many religions in the world, and every religion has its own theological axis, which basically says what the primary tenets of that religion are. But Judaism is very special. From all the nations and all the religions, we're special because we're a combination. We have a national axis, we are a nation, right? And we have a religious aspect, we have theological aspect, we have religious beliefs. So, for example, let's look at the theological axis of Judaism, right? There's laws that tell us how we pray to God. That's purely theological. There are laws that tell us what we can eat. There are laws that tell us what beracha we say before we eat, right? So we have many, many mitzvot related to the religious or theological axis of Judaism. But unlike other religions, we also have the national political axis, right? So we are constituted as a nation. By the way, Judaism has three branches of government, right? Who knows what the three branches are? We have the king, we have a monarchy, right? The monarchy is constituted as a republic in the sense that there's local shevatim. Each shevet has its own governing body, but then there's a monarchy, so we have a monarchy. That's one branch of government. We have the legislative judiciary, which in Judaism is combined. So it's not like in America where you have, for example, you have the Congress, and then you have the Supreme Court, right? But rather in Judaism it's combined. And then you have the third branch of government, and that is the, it's actually outside government, but it's very important. Who knows what it is? It's the Navi, the prophet. Because sometimes people screw things up, right? Sometimes the ruling class don't make the right decisions. Sometimes they are making bad decisions. So we need the Navi who comes to the king and he tells him, you're doing some mistakes. So we have this national political axis to Judaism. And I want to talk tonight about something that's related to the national, not the theology. That's when we study about berachot, we study about tefillah, we study about Shabbat. Today I want to talk about the political axis, and a particular aspect of the political aspect, and I'm talking about history. I want to speak to you about one of the most important concepts in Judaism, which is the national memory of the Jewish people, the national memory of Israel. As some of you may know, I went to Columbia University and I majored in history. And I actually majored specifically in Jewish history. And I studied with the late, great Professor Yerushalmi, who wrote and lectured, and he wrote books and articles. And one of the things he pointed out was very interesting. He was an expert not just in history, but in historiography. So I'll tell you in a moment what historiography is about. What's the difference between history and historiography? So the best way to put it is as follows. You have the Greeks, and you have the Western world. The Greeks were great at documenting historical events. So you have, for example, Herodotus was a Greek historian, and he traveled the world, and he got stories from all over the world, and he has books on history where he documents things that took place. So here's the event that took place in Persia, here's the events that took place in Greece. Obviously, he speaks a lot about Greece. He doesn't speak too much about the Jewish people. Interesting about that, that's my father discusses why that would be. But anyway, the Western world is great at documenting events, right? Jews, we don't just document events, but that's less interesting to us, right? You know what makes us special? We're the first people that we try to find meaning in events. Meaning, among the Greeks, okay, things happen, whatever. There was an earthquake, people died, let's go on to the next story, right? Jewish people, Judaism, the Torah, says that historical events have meaning, right? So what makes the Jewish people special, or one of the things that makes the Jewish people special, is our historiography, how we perceive history. And we believe that there was a decisive significance to history. So let me give you some examples. Let's say, imagine the Jewish people, they're in Jerusalem, and they see that the Babylonians are coming, and eventually the Babylonians reach the gates of Jerusalem. This is during the first Commonwealth in the days of Jeremiah, and the Babylonians enter the city, they ransack the city, they destroy it, and eventually they reach the Bet HaMikdash, and they destroy the Bet HaMikdash. Now, many people were destroyed over the course of history. There were many nations that were ransacked, there were many nations that were taken over, and eventually those nations disappeared. But what made the Jewish people special is that we looked at what happened to us and we tried to find meaning in the tragedy. So we didn't just, okay, there was an earthquake, there was a tsunami, there's a war now in Ukraine and Russia, okay, wars happen, things happen, no, but rather we introspected. So there is, at the end of the book of Echa, which is the historical description of the terrible events that took place in Jerusalem during the destruction, during the Babylonians, there's a great pasuk that summarizes everything that I'm saying now. The pasuk says, "Nachpesa derachenu v'nachgora v'nashuva ad Adonai." It means, and now that we saw everything that took place, and now that we are aware of all the tragedies, the city of Jerusalem was burnt and destroyed, people were killed, people went to exile, let us examine our actions. God is giving us a message. He's telling us, look, you're doing things that are bad. And the historical events that took place made us pause and consider what it is that we did that brought about these terrible events. You see? So we didn't just say, oh, it just happened. Okay, it happened, whatever. Sometimes the economy goes up, sometimes the economy goes down, sometimes there's a market crash. No, Jews always say, wait, hold on. What happened before World War I? There must have been something humanity was doing, and there was actually. And what happened before World War II? And what's taking place what's taking place nowadays? I didn't say it's World War III, but what's taking place nowadays, right? So that's the Jewish approach. The Jewish approach is always to try to find meaning in history. And I want to end this part of the class by reading to you a quote from Professor Yerushalmi. I think this was in his book, Zachor, which it was a great book. It was a monumental book. So here it is. So pay attention. It's not in the sources. I'm sorry. I got this particular source after this source sheet was already printed. So I apologize that it's not here. But
is it meaning of just Jewish history or meaning in any history?
Well, we look at ourselves. We know that we have a special relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And we know that if something happens, if there's a drought, and chas v'shalom people are dying, there's a reason. So that's a historical event, there's a drought. We know that it's not just haphazard. We don't attribute it to global warming. I'm not saying there is or there isn't global warming, but I'm saying if there was some sort of global climactic cataclysm, so we would say, well, there's a reason for that. And the reason has to do with our behavior. So what are we doing wrong? And what could we be doing to improve our behavior? Right? You see that point? That's the idea of meaning.
And is it just through the Nevi'im that we get these messages?
Well, as what you're going to see is one of the purposes, one of the functions of national memory, and I spoke about national memory, is to give every person here and every one of us throughout time the ability to analyze historical situations and compare them to previous situations, and in that way reach conclusions. So we don't always need the Navi. Of course, sometimes if the Navi comes and tells us something, we know it's the Navi, so we accept what he said. But if you study the Nevi'im, if you study the book of Yeshaya, if you study the book of Yirmiyah, if you study the book of Yehezkel and the various Nevi'im, then you can find the patterns and you can make inductive conclusions regarding what's happening today, for example, right? And I do that all the time. And I don't think I'm the only one who does that all the time, but many people who study the Nevi'im, they have the, that contemporary approach to what the Nevi'im are saying. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech ha'olam, she'akol yamid baro. So here's a quote I wanted to read to you, and then we'll go to the next part of the class. The pagan concept of history was replaced by a drama of a different and more poignant order. The paradoxical struggle between the divine will, God, right, and the free will of his creature, man, us, in the course of history. So there's always a struggle, right? God wants to do good unto the Jewish people, but God expects the Jewish people to behave in accordance with the Torah and the mitzvot. And when we don't, then things go wrong, right? And then we are kind of slapped in the face, and we like, what's going wrong? What are we doing wrong? And then we wake up and we return to God as we should. So that's a quote. That's the idea introduced by Professor Yerushalmi. It's a very Jewish idea, and I want to now ask a question. How do Jews remember history? What do we do? For example, is anybody here aware of a mitzvah that says you all have to become historians? I majored in history, but was that because it was a mitzvah to study history? And the answer is no. No. You don't have an obligation to become historians, right? So while knowledge of history is a facet of Jewish national life, there is no mitzvah that says you must study history. That is incorrect. But rather, the Torah.
How do you?
Right. So I'm going to say it now.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
How do you study history, not as a historian?
Yeah.
Or what does Zachor mean?
Right.
How do you know history if you don't remember?
Right. So rather, and now I will address that question, the Torah, when we study the Perashat HaShavua and we study the incidents that took place to the Jewish people before we entered Egypt, when we were in Egypt, after we left Egypt, when we were in the desert, when we were in Israel, and now this is going to the Nevi'im, we study these events not to become historians, but to become conscious of those national historical events that took place to us. So the imperative is not fulfilled by reading history books. I'll give you one example, and then I'll give you another example. You all know about Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? You all know what happened? Anybody here read history books on the Exodus? National Geographic? No, and yet you know it. You know it very well. And how do you know it? Because we took Yetziat Mitzrayim. Because we took Yetziat Mitzrayim. And there's a mitzvah, leman tizkor et yom tzedekah me'eretz Mitzrayim kol yemei chayecha. And we took Yetziat Mitzrayim, and the Chachamim, the Torah, transformed that historical event into the ritual of Leil HaSeder. What do we do every once a year? Actually, two nights a year, because we live in the Galut. We have the Haggadah. We discuss Yetziat Mitzrayim. We remember the slavery. We eat matzah to remember that this is what we ate when we were in Egypt. We eat maror to remember that it was really bitter. The Egyptians were not very nice to us, right? So what do? We have these mitzvot in the Torah that are designed to infiltrate our minds with the consciousness of the events that took place. So we don't need to read books on history. In fact, the books on history, if anything, for me, if I was reading a book on the Exodus, it would be boring, it would be redundant. I would catch a million mistakes in the book. This is wrong, that's wrong. Because I know, I have a tradition that goes back thousands of years. It's been going every single year. And this historian, I don't know where he studied and what he studied, but it doesn't interest me. So it's not that we're historians. The mitzvot of the Torah themselves develop within us a consciousness of history. You understand? I gave you one example. There's many mitzvot in the Torah that have to do with history. I'll give you another example. We do it every morning. Tefillin, right? Tefillin, right? Zecher Yetziat Mitzrayim. Right? Within the tefillin is written the summary of what our the four perashiyot. We get the four perashiyot in the tefillin. It's a summary of the Torah. It's a summary of the experience of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Kadesh lichot bechol, petikol rechem. You remember Makat Bechorot, and how Hashem took us out bechol zikad Mitzrayim. So you see, that's another mitzvah. So it develops within us a knowledge of our history. So we have this consciousness, not because we were expected to go to university and study history, because we're expected to follow the mitzvot, and the mitzvot themselves do that. Okay, so I want to tell you that only in the Jewish people is there a mitzvah of Zachor. What does Zachor mean? It is a national imperative to the entire people to remember. We must remember, right? Zachor, what happened to Miriam in the desert when she spoke against Moshe Rabbeinu. And there's other Zachor. Today I want to speak about one specific Zachor. But, for example, remember what happened to Miriam. That's another example. It says Zachor. Remember what happened to Miriam. She spoke against Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was a leader, and she spoke ill of him. Remember that. We shouldn't speak ill of good people. Moses was a good person, right? We should always try to find the good in others, right? So as a nation, it's very easy. It's very easy to criticize. It really is. We can criticize anybody, including me, right? We can, right? You can criticize anybody, and there's a lot to criticize about all of us, right? And Zachon, remember Miriam. Was Miriam right that Moshe Rabbeinu left his wife and so on? Okay, I mean, empirically, yes, she just didn't understand why. So she could have criticized Moshe Rabbeinu. Zachon. So there, you see, that's a national event. Something took place, and we're always supposed to think about that, because as a nation, we should always try to think about the good in other Jews. Always try to find something positive about the Jewish people, because that's a much healthier existence. You see that? So that's example of national memory transformed into a particular mode of behavior. Now I want to talk about
Interesting. So it's the behavioral, experiential actions or requirements to remember things that's where the memory, or that's where history is like, where we study history. We act out history. We live history.
We live it.
We live it. It's
Exactly. For us, when Herodotus studied about the Persian wars, it was a story, it was interesting, but it wasn't part of who he was. When we remember the story of Miriam HaNeviah speaking about Moshe Rabbeinu and Chazita, she got Sarat, and what happened to her, and then eventually she came back into the Mahaneh, right? When we remember that story, it's a lesson for how we live our lives, right? If there's a great man like Moshe Rabbeinu, don't just, easy to criticize him, don't. It's a mistake. Try to find the good in him, right? And there's a danger to not remembering. The danger to forgetting. Let me give you, and the Torah goes over and over again, where the Jewish people forget. Now, let me give you one of the great examples of forgetting. What happens when there's loss of memory? So we know how sometimes there's older people, they have amnesia when they get older. It's natural. What are you going to do? The neurons in the brain are not, sending out messages. There's loss of memory and there's amnesia. When there's memory loss at the national level, catastrophe ensues. I'll give you one simple example. It's one of the craziest stories. What?
There you go.
Yes, thank you. One of the craziest stories is not the story of the Egel itself, which, okay, I explained that a few weeks ago, if you remember, what the Egel was about. I explained what Egel Hazav was about and why the Avon was and how they made the mistake. They didn't really believe the Egel itself was God, but rather they thought it was a medium through which to reach God. Okay, but it was a terrible Avon. It was Avodah Zarah. The crazy story is not the story of the Egel. The crazy story is the story that takes place about 500 years later in the land of Israel. After King Solomon dies, the land of Israel splits into two. There's a civil war. There's a northern kingdom. There's a southern kingdom, which has Jerusalem as its capital. But the northern kingdom did not have Jerusalem. And the king there, Yarovam ben Nevat, was concerned. He was concerned that people now are going to travel to Jerusalem on the holidays, and they're going to be leaving the northern kingdom. He didn't like that. He wanted to establish 2 shrines in the north. And what did he do to attract the people? What was his selling point? Free internet? No. Free Wi-Fi? No. Free iPhones? No. He did. He had 2 Egel Hazavi. He created 2 golden calves, right? He created 2 golden calves, and he said, guys, we have these golden calves here. They don't have them in Jerusalem. I mean, whoa, are you not aware of what happened the last time we did the Egel Hazav? Did you forget that? And the answer is, yeah, they forgot. That's why national memory is so important, because when you don't have national memory, when you forget, then catastrophe ensues. And that's a great example. And eventually the whole northern kingdom was destroyed. By the way, the 10 lost tribes were in the northern kingdom. What happened to them? They got lost. That's why they're called the 10 lost tribes. Where are they? I don't know. You tell me. Till today. Now the southern kingdom, where they didn't do an Egel Hazav, they had other Avonot, but they never did the Egel Hazav. We survived. We're the descendants of the kingdom of Jerusalem, right? That's why we're called Yehudim. Yehudi is from the tribe of Judah. So we're all from the tribe of Judah, or perhaps Benjamin, or the Leviim, the Kohanim, but that's it. Who's Shevet Reuven? Raise your hand. Shevet Shimon, Shevet Yisachar, Shevet Zebulun, Shevet Dan. Oh, which one? Wise guy. Okay, you chose a good tribe though. Yisachar with the Chachamim, so good. I like that.
I said idols, idols, not iPhones.
I like that. Okay. So you see what happens. So that's why in the Torah, Hashem is always telling us, remember what happened. These historical events are lessons for the nation. Okay, so now I want to.
How many times do we repeat in the Torah?
I think the word Zachor, I think appears 10 times, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, I'm talking about the Hamisha Chumshe Torah. Yeah.
I'm the God who took you out of Egypt. We repeat
Uh-huh.
it over and over.
Right. Yes.
A million times in the Torah.
Yeah.
You better remember it.
That's correct. Now I want to talk about the role of memory with respect to Amalek. Okay? National Jewish memory in the case of the attitude towards Amalek. Take out the source sheet. We're going to read the first account, right? And the first word in the source sheet, there's two sides. We're at the part where it says Devarim Parashat Zachor. This is actually what we're going to be reading on Shabbat. It says, okay, it says, Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek b'derech b'setechem miMisraim. Remember, you see the instruction there? Remember what Amalek did to you when you were on the road leaving Egypt. By the way, this story took place within the first 50 days. We didn't even reach Har Sinai yet, meaning we just left Egypt. We just crossed the Red Sea, Yam Suf, right? Asher karecha b'derech. He chanced upon you on the road. You were traveling towards Har Sinai, and he chanced upon you. Vayzanev becha kol hanecheshalim acharecha. And he attacked you from the rear, right? Usually when there's a war, how does the army come? The army comes frontal attack, front to front. Here they attacked the rear of the Jewish people, and what was the thinking there? Kol hanecheshalim acharecha. He wanted to exact maximum casualties by killing the weak. Neheshalim means those who are weak. Meaning it was not for military purposes. He specifically wanted to kill Jews, and the easiest way to kill Jews is to go after the older people, the weak people, the children, right? You were not ready for war, you were thirsty, you were exhausted, and you had no knowledge of God yet, because this is before you even reached Har Sinai, so you still didn't reach the Torah. And therefore, I am giving you the following instructions. There will come a day where you will reach the land of Israel, and in the land of Israel you will have defeated your enemies, and you will be in a state of peace. You will reach the land, you will reach the promised land, you will be in your inheritance. Then you will have to go on one additional war. Timheh et zecher Amalek, you will have to go to a war which will be to eradicate the memory of Amalek from under the heaven, lo tishkach. And God repeats at the end what he said in the beginning. At the beginning he said, Zachor. Zachor means remember. And at the end he says, lo tishkach, do not forget. Right? So those are actually two mitzvot. There's the mitzvah that says Zachor, the mitzvah that says lo tishkach. So that's the mitzvah of Amalek. It's a description of the incident that took place, as I said, and there's three things I want to glean from the verses. Well, there's many things we can glean from these verses, but there's three things I want to glean for purposes of this class. Number one, the attack was unprovoked. It was unprovoked. It's not like we were, going close to their land. It's not like we were entering their land. It's not like we were throwing stones at them. No reason. We were passing through empty, uninhabited desert. Number one. Number two, the attack was unanticipated. It was sudden. We had no advance warning. It's not like they said, guys, we're going to attack you if you do X, if you don't do X, Y, Z, nothing. It was completely unanticipated. And the final point I wanted to glean for purposes of this class is the attack was carried out against the weak and the infirm, people who cannot defend themselves. They specifically targeted people who are defenseless. Those are the people that Amalek attacked. To me, this sounds a lot like terrorism, right? I mean, I think the definition of terrorism is where you're going to have a tactical attack against innocent people to cause maximum pain and maximum death and injury. but you're not achieving any military goals. I think that's literally a description of what took place here, and I think that's a description of what terrorism is. Thank God that, and Yehidah that should continue, but terrorism in Israel in the last few years, Baruch Hashem, with God's infinite grace and kindness of the Jewish people, has really gone down a lot. I remember when I lived in Israel, there was insane times where it was like just crazy. But anyway, so we talk about Timchayat Zecher Amalek. There was a mitzvah to eradicate the Amalekites. So I said I want to identify for you who the Amalekites are, right? So you're all ready? So what I'm going to tell you today in this class is as follows, that the Amalekites are defined less by ethnicity and more by particular character traits. Okay, and I will demonstrate that in the class. We have 30 minutes left. I think hopefully we'll finish on time, if not earlier. So a few points to consider. Number one, what were the actual atrocities committed by Amalek? Look at the verses and you tell me, what atrocities did Amalek commit? If you look at the verse, it's a trick question. If you look at the verse describing what they did, it doesn't really describe the atrocities, does it? So how do we know what the atrocities are? In fact, look at the second source now, because this war with Amalek was described two places in the Torah. It's described in Perashat Kiteseh, which is what we read on Shabbat Zachor. We're going to read the Shabbat. And it's also described in Perashat Beshalach, and Beshalach. And that's what we read Purim in the morning. So let's look at the second source. Let's see if you can identify what the atrocities are. All right?
In the second source?
In the second source. I'm going to read it now. Vayavo Amalek. Amalek arrived. Vayilachem im Yisrael v'Refidim, and begun to wage a war against the Jewish people in Refidim. Again, just so you understand, these two sources are parallel sources. They're describing the same exact incident. They're describing the same exact event, only from a slightly different perspective, from a slightly different lens. Right? Vayomer Moshe el Yehoshua, Moses tells Joshua, Behalanu anashim, choose soldiers, V'sei lachem ba'Amalek, and I want you to wage a war, a defensive war against Amalek. You don't have that in the first source. The first source does not mention the Jewish response to Amalek, right? Tomorrow I will be on the high mountain. I will hold in my hand the staff of God, right? The special mateh through which he did the miracles. And Joshua did exactly what Moses told him. He gathered an army, and he began to wage a war against the Amalekites. Moshe, Aharon, up to the top of the mountain comes Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was in the middle. Aharon was on his right side. Hur was on his left side, or reverse. I'm sorry. And Moses had his hands reached up in prayer to God. But as you know, there's so long you can hold your arms up. And eventually his arms would go down because he was tired and he just couldn't hold it for so long. And whenever his hands would be up, the Jewish people would be winning the war, and when his hands would go down, they would be losing the war. The Gemara Masechet Rosh Hashanah describes what that is about. Not a subject for today's class, but nevertheless, we read it. And Videh Moshe Kebedim, and you can read the source later on. But I do want to read to you the last pasuk. It says, Vayomer Adonai Moshe, Ketov zot zikaron basefer. I want you to write this as a memory, as a record in a book. Vesim be'oznei Yehoshua. I want you to teach this to Joshua, and it is the following: I will eradicate the memory of the Amalekites from under the heaven. Right? And eventually, going to the last pasuk. I'm sorry. Vayomer ki yad al kes yah milchama Adonai ba'Amalek midor. And God symbolically, and of course this is a symbol. Obviously, you know God doesn't have a hand, but He puts His hand on the throne and He makes a shavua on the holy throne. Similar to that, if we take a person to a bet to make a shavua and betin, and we give him a sefer Torah to hold as he makes a shavua, that becomes a solemn oath. So God's promise is to eradicate the Amalekites from under the heaven. What we learn in the book of Devarim, which is the first source we read, is God is expecting us to do that. Right? That's one of the mitzvot, is we have to go wage the war against the Amalekim, but if we wage the war against the Amalekim, the war will be a successful war, and we will eradicate the Amalekites. So back to the question, what atrocities are described in the Pesukim? None. Why? Where are the atrocities? The answer is in the first word, zachor, remember. That's committed to Jewish national memory. Jewish national memory remembers the atrocities of the Amalekites. It remembers that they killed innocent people in a cruel fashion, and we understand that fully. So that's that's zachor. So again, Jewish national memory. We have a Torah shebichtav, but we also have a Torah shebe'al peh, and right, and we know, and we identify the Amalekim with the proto or the progenitors of all anti-Semites. So all anti-Semites, they come after Amalek, right? So anytime you see an anti-Semitic brute, what does it remind you of? Amalek. We remember Amalek, okay? So I want you to think about how do we fulfill the mitzvah of remembering Amalek. So I'm just touching upon it, but for now, we fulfill the mitzvah of remembering Amalek by identifying anti-Semitic brutes, identifying those brutes with Amalek. So if there's an anti-Semite and he acts in a cruel way, I think there was a recent attack on Avenue J East 14th Street. There was an old man, right? And he was attacked just, I think, maybe 2-3 days ago. He was an old man. He was sitting down. I guess it was hard for him to stand. And somebody came and attacked him. To me, that's reminiscent of Amalek. Again, I don't know if the guy was crazy or not. It could be that the guy was crazy. I don't know. But it reminded me of Amalek. And why are you attacking an old man? Did he take anything from him? So these types of anti-Semitic attacks, again, assuming it was anti-Semitic, I don't know the facts. I'm just describing to you. What will remind us of Amalek is these types of brutal anti-Semitic attacks. So what do we do with that? What is the mitzvah? Look at the next source in the source sheet. And now you're going to see that beyond the philosophical idea, beyond the Jewish national memory, there is also actual halacha. We are now going to read Hilchot Melachim Perek Aleph. This is a quote from Harambam. So Harambam summarized all of the laws of the Torah. This is from Maimonides, from Harambam, the end of the Mishneh Torah, and it says as follows. This has to do with national laws. Shalosh mitzvot nisavu Yisrael b'sha'at knisatan la'aretz. When the Jewish people enter the land of Israel, they have 3 obligations. There are 3 obligations that they must fulfill as a nation. Number 1, libnot lahem melech. They must appoint the king. The Jewish system is a monarchy. I know people, we do like democracy, and democracy definitely has some advantages. The disadvantage of democracy is that oftentimes we're duped by leaders who pretend to be something, and it ends up there's something completely different, right? In the case, for example, of Israel, it's a democracy, which of course we all support democracy. I'm not this, but the person who is the prime minister of Israel got, I think like 6% of the vote. I mean, it's almost comical. I mean, right? He got like 6% of the vote, and he's running the country to the chagrin of almost the entire people. So it comes out that democracy is not always so democratic, is it, right? So Judaism just has a very simple solution. Our solution is we have a monarch from David HaMelech, and he's chosen by God, and God is telling us this particular monarch that I'm choosing is fantastic. He'll be the greatest leader you ever had. Hey, he has my vote. Okay, so number 1, Som Tesim Alech HaMelech, we have a monarchy, and it's great because then all this special interests. I'll just give you an example, and maybe I should talk about this more. It's like government is so farcical. I mean, it's just like it's like almost farcical. It's almost funny. For example, you have Facebook, you have Google, you have YouTube. Every single one of these technology companies is a violation of federal law, the Anti-Sherman Act, and everybody knows it. They know it. The Congress people know it. The antitrust authorities know it. The Supreme Court knows it. But it doesn't matter because it's a farce, right? If you had a monopoly, they'll come after you. Right? But real monopolies, right? So you understand. So we speak about democracy. So why is that? Because when you have democracy, you have special interests, you have people coming in, lobbying, and there's always this financial rewards and other types of rewards, and ultimately in democratic systems, most of the ruling class are there to serve the ruling class. So there's a political elite which is there to serve the aristocracy. By aristocracy, I mean the super wealthy, and they're there to protect them from the laws and let them do whatever they want to do. So that's the Goy system, and I know many people still like democracy. I'm not against it. I love democracy, but I'm just telling you that the Jewish system is a monarchy, and it solves many of those problems. So that's the first mitzvah. The second mitzvah is ulachrit zar'ov shel Amalek. The second mitzvah is to destroy the Amalekites. I got to tell you, by the way, personally, when you study about the Holocaust and the atrocities that were committed in the Holocaust, it's hard to believe. Does anybody think that the Goyim who committed those acts got what was coming to them? I don't, right? I don't. I think we have as I think I mentioned it on Shabbat, I think there's a big overdue bill. I mean, it's a big bill, right? So one of the things the Mashiach is going to have to do is le'achrit zar'o shel Amalek, to destroy Amalek, right? Shneimar timcha et zecher Amalek. And the third thing that's only done after you destroy Amalek, velivnot lahem bet ha'bechira, and to build the Bet HaMikdash. So that's going to be so those are the three things that are done. Now, look at the order of things. Look at the next halacha. Minui melech. Yes, anu po.
There's no miklat, setting up miklat.
4. Oh no, that's one of the things. But that's like now we're talking like the big national, national level type things. Minui melech kodem le'melchemet Amalek. So first you appoint a king, and only after you appoint a king, you go to war against Amalek, because it's going to be the king that does the war against Amalek. Shneimar lo tishalach Adonai limshochacha lemelech. Right? When Shaul is appointed as king, the first thing that God tells Shemuel HaNavi to tell Shaul HaMelech, go fight a war against the Amalekim. Right? And before we build the Bet HaMikdash, we first destroy Amalek. So interesting. First you destroy Amalek, only then can you build the Bet HaMikdash. It's almost like Amalek is an impure force in the world, and that impure force doesn't allow us to build the Bet HaMikdash. But once that impure force is gone, then we can build the Bet HaMikdash, right? That's just some food for thought. So that's the order of things. V'chen, and going now to the last halacha he. V'chen misvat aseh le'abed zera Amalek. There is a mitzvah to eradicate the Amalekites. Shneimar timcha et zecher Amalek. As the pasuk says, you must eradicate the memory of the Amalekites. I want to ask you a question. This sounds to me, that it can be interpreted in a negative way, right? But I want to actually tell you that I think if you consider what the pasuk really says, it's a little. It'll give you some flavor. So I want to get back to the question that I asked. Do we understand Amalek in terms of ethnicity? Meaning, the Torah just said, Rambam just said, that we have to identify Amalek and then we have to wage a war against Amalek. How do we identify Amalek? Do we do a genetic test? Do we do a DNA test? What do we do?
Behavior.
Ooh, I like that. That's good.
What was the answer?
He just said behavior. And I want to tell you that what he just said is absolutely correct, and I will prove it to you. Because there's a famous Mishnah in Masechet Yadayim, I think it's Perek Daled, and it's also in Masechet Berachot, and it's in the source sheet. In the source sheet, if you turn it around, I want to read to you this. It's a Mishnah. And the purpose of bringing this Mishnah is to show you that we can no longer identify the ethnic groups that were around during the days of the Bible. All right? Now, if we can't identify the ethnic groups that were around during the days of the Bible, how can we possibly find and identify Amalek? Good question. Okay, so let me just read to you. Bo bayom. It was on this day, this is the day that Rabban Gamliel was impeached and removed from his leadership of the yeshiva in Yavne, right? Bo bayom. Ba Yehuda ger Amoni lifnei beit HaMikdash. It was a proselyte. His name was Yehuda, and he was from Ammon. Now the thing is, the Torah actually says, Lo yavo Amoni b'kal Hashem. There was a law in the Torah that if a person from Ammon, an Ammonite, Ammon is where Jordan is today, right? So if a person from Ammon converts, he's a convert. Okay, he's Jewish, but he can't marry within the Jewish people. Interesting law. Special law for Ammon. There's a similar law for Moab. There's a similar law for Misri, for Edomi. Those 4 groups, whatever the reason is. And there's details to the law, okay? There's variations in the law. Anyway, this person was a proselyte. He was from Ammon. And he said, Mani la babakal. He said, I want to marry a Jewish girl. Can I do that? It says, well, sorry, no, you can't. Because it says, La Amoni bikal Hashem. So if you want to marry somebody, you can marry another proselyte, right, or something of that nature, but you can't marry Bat Yisrael. Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua, mutar lavo bakal. Rabbi Yoshua disagreed with Rabbi Gamliel. Says, no, you can marry. So Rabbi Gamliel was like surprised. Amar lo Rabbi Gamliel, v'alo kevani amar lo yavo Amoni u'Moavi bikal Hashem. So Rabbi Gamliel turns to Rabbi Yoshua and says, what are you talking about? The pasuk says explicitly it's forbidden for an Ammoni, meaning a ger, a proselyte that converted from the country of Ammon, he's now allowed to marry within the Jewish people. It's a pasuk in the Torah. You can't ignore that pasuk. Amar lo Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua says, you're right. V'chi Ammon u'Moab b'mkumam ha'niyushim are the people who live in the country of Ammon today. This is in the days of the Mishnah, right? Meaning right after the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash, right after the destruction of the Second Commonwealth, let's say the year, I don't know, just complete speculation, like the year 80 AD, right? The year 80 CE, I'm sorry. So he says, the people who live in Transjordan, are these the original Ammonites? Are these the original Moabites? In the days of the first Commonwealth, there was a king of Assyria. He made a huge war in all of the Near East region, and he took nations from one country. His strategy was as follows. He would go into country A. When he would get to country A, he would take all the inhabitants of country A and exile them to another country. But now he needs people in country A working the economy. He would take people from country B, put them in country A. And he mixed up all the nations, right? His name was Sancherib. He's the one, by the way, who took away the 10 tribes, just so you know. So after Sancherib came, he mixed up all the nations. Shneimar ve'asir gevulot amim ve'atulotehem shosheti. As the pasuk says, that I destroyed all the boundaries of the nations. We have the law. If a guy comes from Ammon, is he original Ammonite? No. I mean, we can't make that assumption. So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is, if you look at the last 4 words of this paragraph, miyad hitiruhu lavo bakahal, he was allowed to marry a Jewish girl. So here we see that as a matter of law, we can no longer identify the original nations. We can't. So as an ethnic matter, ethnicity is no longer relevant in that sense, right? We just don't know who's who. Now, I want now to read to you, look at the next source. This is Harambam, and you'll see that Harambam, as a matter of law, makes Pesach Halacha exactly like this Gemara. Mikey, you want to read the Gemara? Kishe'ala Sancherib? Right. When King Sancherib came to the Near East, he made war against all the nations, and he mixed up all the nations. Nobody is in their original country. For example, the Egyptians in Egypt today, says Harambam, are not the original Egyptians that were there in the days of the first Commonwealth.
The original Egyptians were red skin.
Right, exactly. They were African. Yeah, correct. Also, the Edomites that were in Sedeh Edom, it's not the original people from Edom. So if somebody comes from Egypt today and says, I want to become Jewish, yeah, you can become Jewish, of course. Can I marry a Jewish girl? Yeah. Or what about the law of Lo Yavo Misi B'Kal Hashem? An Egyptian cannot marry a Jewish girl. We don't know who the Egyptians are, right? So that's a matter of law. So let me ask you. Right, Kol de Parish Meruba Parish. There's a Kelal that says that if something separates from a larger mass, the assumption is Ahare Rabim Lehatot. In the Torah says the Doraita law, Ahare Rabim Lehatot, we look at the majority, and the majority is not Egyptian, or the majority is not Ammoni. So that's actual law. So let me ask a question: how can we ever fulfill the mitzvah of eradicating the Amalekites? I'll ask you another question. In the days of Megillat Esther, we said that Haman was Haman HaAgagi. How do we know that Haman was Haman HaAgagi? Okay, so I'm going to tell you a great chidush. By the way, 90% of what I said today is from my father. My father wrote an article about this. My father wrote in his book, The Horizontal Society, Volume 2. It's a 2-volume book. He has a whole section on this. 90% of what I said comes from my father, if not 95%. So I want to just attribute what I'm saying. This chidush is a great chidush from my father. He found it in Rabbi Ishaq Abul Afia. Rabbi Ishaq Abul Afia was one of the great Chachamim from Syria, Damascus, in the 19th century. He has a book called Penei Ishaq. It's quoted widely by all the poskim. And he's dealing with a particular issue which is related to Amalek. And he says the following chidush, and it's a great chidush, right? He says as follows. The Torah, when it says Timcheh et Zecher Amalek, it says eradicate the memory of Amalek. He points out the Torah doesn't say Timcheh et Zera Amalek. It could have said eradicate the seed of Amalek. It doesn't say seed. It says Zecher. What does Zecher mean? So he says Israel has a national memory. We remember how Amalek behaved. When we see Goyim acting towards us as Amalek acted towards us back then, we automatically associate them with Amalek. We don't need to do a DNA test. We don't need to check their genetics. We don't need to ask them where their mother was, who their father was. It doesn't matter to us because they remind us of Amalek and they behave like Amalek. They are Amalek. And the mitzvah of Timcheh et Zecher Amalek applies to that person or those group of people. Best example in Megillat Esther. The Jewish people are in Persia. We have Haman HaAgagi. How do we know he's Agagi? Agag means he's a descendant of Amalek. How do we know? I know, but how do the Jewish people know that he was Amalek? Because, first of all, he might have actually been Agagi. I'm not saying he wasn't, but just so you understand, I actually think that descendants of Amalek who are still around would be the ones to act like this, but not necessarily, and I'll prove to you in a moment. He acted like Amalek, right? Le'ashmid, laharog, ulabed et kol ha'yehudim. So one Jew doesn't behave nicely to him. He doesn't like the fact that the Jew, he wants to kill every single Jew. Where does that come from? I don't know if chas v'shalom, a particular ethnic minority does something bad to somebody, are we going to say kill chas v'shalom? I mean, what type of sick person says, I want to kill every person in that particular ethnic minority? I mean, you would say that person is deranged. So the answer is, yeah, Haman was deranged. He obviously was deranged, right? But what does this crazy hatred towards the Jewish people come from? That's Amalek. He reminds us of Amalek, and we refer to him as Haman HaGagi because of his behavior. So that's such an important thing. I want to bring to you, Joe, about, there's a Gemara in Masechet Gittin, and it says something almost crazy. I think it's not in the source sheet. Again, I brought this afterwards, but I'm going to read to you what the Gemara says. Tana, Naaman ger toshavaya, Nevuzar Adan ger sedekaya. So Naaman was the one who saw Elisha Hanavi, made Tevilah in the Jordan River. Nevuzar Adan, he's the one who burnt the Bet HaMikdash. But then it says, Mi bnei banav shel Haman, lamedu Torah b'bnei Berak. From the children, the descendants of Haman, they studied Torah in Bnei Berak. Bnei Berak was a city of Chachamim, and among the people studying Torah in Bnei Berak back then, in the days of the Mishnah, were descendants of Haman HaRasha, right? It continues, it says, Mi bnei banav shel Sisera, and the Gemara continues. The question is as follows. If these people are from the children of Haman, so why are we not killing them? They're Amalek, we should kill them.
Right.
We should. We didn't. Why not? Because it's not Zera Amalek. If it was Zera Amalek, we'd have to kill them. And you would say that's ethnic cleansing. But the truth, we don't believe in ethnic cleansing. We never did. What we believe in is that if somebody is a real brute, let's put it this way. We're created in the image of God. Every human being is created in the image of God, and we have a certain compassion and a certain kindness, and we're willing to tolerate different types of people and different levels of religion and even different levels of morality. We're pretty tolerant, meaning our nature, the Jewish people, we're a tolerant people. We don't just go around and shoot anybody who's a little different than us. when the crazy Muslim fanatics took over Spain in the 10th and 11th century, they went and they burnt down mosques because they were too beautiful. And Muslims burnt down mosques because they were too beautiful. So we don't do that, right? But at the same time, there is a level of inhuman behavior that is so beneath common decency, right? Atrocities committed by terrorists against innocent people that are just so, unacceptable and maddening that we say, okay, if this person acts like Amalek, we're not going to tolerate it. No, we're just not going to tolerate it, and we're going to do something about it. So, like what the Nazis did in World War II, right? So that's a story of Amalek. So Zecher Amalek means the memory of Amalek's behavior. And I just want to read to you now the actual quote from Rabbi Yitzhak Abul Afi. This is a translation of my father. My father translated it in his book, so I'm reading you the quote. From the preceding, we have learned that a people who become infamous because of the manner in which they conducted their attack against the Jewish people were designated Amalek. That's Amalek. It's not ethnic. It has to do with behavior. This identification may take place even in our own days, says Rabbi Yitzhak Abul Afia. When people that are ethnically mixed, it could be that this particular person was Hitler, was he an actual Amalekite? I actually believe he was. But it doesn't matter. Let's say somebody proves to me that no, his grandmother's father was actually something else. I don't care. How does that in any way mitigate or minimize from what he did, right? So at any rate, once, and I'm continuing the quote of Rabbi Yitzhak Abul Afia, once that they are identified as Amalek because of their behavior, they are one and the same with Amalek. And to eradicate them will constitute, in fact, erasing the name of Amalek. That's Rabbi Yitzhak Abul Afia. That's the quote that my father brings in his article, and then later on he brings it in his book. It's a great quote. It solves a heck of a lot of problems. Yes, sir.
Okay, question. So you mentioned that it's not a nation, but you keep mentioning the Nazis who were a nation,
Yeah.
who were against them. That's
Yeah.
number one. Number two, they're all spread all over the world today. You see anti-Semitism in every city, in every town, everywhere across the world. So you're saying we have to wage war and according to the Torah to kill all these people? That's impossible.
Okay, so the first question. The Nazis, they were a national group. I agree with you. They were Amalek. I mean, that was real Amalek, because here you have a nation. Right. Now, the question you asked is a very interesting question, meaning when the Mashiach is told, Amalek, will be targeting individuals, or will he be targeting nations, particular nations that presumptively would be behaving like that? Like, for example, when Israel's Mossad, one of the reasons it was established originally was to hunt down Nazis in Argentina, right? So they were targeting individuals, right? So what's the Mashiach going to do? I don't know. It's a good question. I just don't know. I would think that if we know, like if there's an actual, anti-Semite that was harassing Jews or, being cruel to Jews or doing whatever, that I would like that person to be brought to justice. But, again, that's me, and it doesn't really, my personal feelings shouldn't matter.
So you're saying like Ahmadinejad, as an example? I'm saying,
again, maybe there'll be some threshold. What did he do? Did he just speak like, say, I don't want to, again, but it could be, it could very well be that a lot of the horrible atrocities that were committed in the land of Israel by many of the Palestinian terrorists. I mean, just simply, they actually had a museum in Shechem of these the pizza bombing that took place in Jerusalem years ago, right? It was simply. That's to me, that's Amalek. Like they're going there giggling and laughing. It's, I feel bad for them because they're very sick people. So I feel bad that there's people like that, but it's just, as a human being, it's difficult to accept that type of, they're mocking the Jews in such a horrible way. That would be Amalek. I would say go in and that would be my advice. If the Mashiach comes to me, if he asks me for my advice, I would tell him, go in and just, give them what they deserve. Yes, Bernie.
So the three requirements two of the three requirements, once you enter the land, is to appoint a king, and that king has to be strong enough to defeat the Amalek.
Yes.
So why didn't, who was it, Shaul?
Shaul.
Why didn't he follow the direct law?
That is a very good question. Why did Shaul not kill Amalek? That's actually a subject for a class. It's a great question. It is. But I think like we'll call it a night here. It's 9. That's it. I think it's a good place to stop. Unless it's a question not as good as that, something a little easier. Yes, less question, but an easy question, please.
Just follow up on Joe's question, just comment and
Yeah.
answer the question after. So I believe the Zohar brings down that when Mashiach comes, all the enemies of Israel are going to face retribution.
Yeah.
So is that also, are we considering all our enemies to be Amalek?
No,
And
no,
then-
no. I don't think so at all. Because there's political enemies, there's economic enemies, there's people who want our land, there's people who want our water. That's not Amalek. Amalek is those who just hate Jews for the sake of Jew hatred.
Okay.
Right, saying?
So, yeah, and the question is, you mentioned that, Zech Amalek is the ideology, and therefore it's not necessarily lineage. But Rabbi Abulafias mentions the Zech aspect, and he mentioned that the mitzvah is the Achrit Tzao Shel Amalek.
Yeah, Harambam. That's where Harambam. By the way, and I agree with you. I agree that the B'Yitzchak Abulafia is kind of
And whenever, like, as far as I know, whenever the Torah references the word Zerah, it literally means the offspring.
Right. So I want you to ask me that question Mincha Shabbat, and I will show you why there's a problem with that. There's not enough time. I need 15 minutes, and then you'll understand the B'Yitzchak Abulafia a little better.